Well, we think of the Bible as being God's book, a book all about God. But in my research path for the Eden series, I've discovered the book is about lots of things. The idea of God is in there, but there's a whole load of ancestral thought and ancestral experience in there as well. And that many of the stories we have told as God stories through the ages, when you do translation work on the key words, go to the root meanings of those words, another layer of story emerges. And we discover that the source stories were not about God. They were about something else. Many of the God stories in the Bible are actually summary forms of the ancient Sumerian stories of sky people. And so we have paleo-contact stories that have become God stories. And so I return to the Bible in the Eden Conspiracy, and I ask, what were these stories originally about before they became stories about God? What was it our ancestors originally wanted to tell us? And I find that an encyclopedic, very rich education emerges when you start scratching beneath the surface and go to the original forms of the stories.
And you end up with, of course, an even more complex cast of characters. And of course, what would a story be without the elimination of the feminine?
Yes, that's right.
Is what happened to humanity once the feminine was eliminated from the Bible itself. So why don't we start with the word Yahweh? And many people have read books, and they've read Eric von Däniken, which you're kind of the new Eric von Däniken, actually, looking at this word Yahweh and what it actually means. But I found more depth in your book in this than I had seen in my own studies. So let's talk about Yahweh, because he's supposed to be God and he's supposed to be everywhere, and the book is devoted to Yahweh, the Bible.
In the 6th century BCE, that's when the final redaction was done on what became the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, as Christians call it. And the name Yahweh was the name used to refer to their God concept. And the final edit was intended to rework this great library of Hebrew texts and turn it into a seamless story of God. And Yahweh was the name they used for God. But as I show in the Eden Conspiracy, when that name first occurs in the Bible, and when that character shows up, it's clear that that entity was something else, that it was not God, it was a particular character that carried that name. And so Yahweh does a great evolution as a word through the course of the Bible. It begins as a name given to a colonizer. And we have stories of violent colonization that run through the Old Testament. By the time we get to the end of the Hebrew scriptures and we're listening to the minor prophets, they're using the word Yahweh in a completely different way to refer to a transcendent being. So I go back to the beginning and say, well, what was Yahweh in the beginning? Who was that character who took that name? And where did that word come from? Because if you go to Jewish scholars, they puzzle over what this word is, what it means, because it doesn't appear to have any etymology, any word history in the Semitic language. It appears as a loan word. And so an example of that would be in the post-war period, linguists started discovering words being used in Italy and Sicily that they didn't recognize. And one was Siriola, Siriola, and one was Sciavolo, Sciavelo. That's how they were written down. And they thought, well, these aren't Italian words. We don't recognize, there's no history to these words. And it took them a while to twig. These were loan words. Siriola was city hall, but just written in an Italian way. And Sciavolo was shovel, written in an Italian way. And Yahweh is that kind of a word, a foreign word. It may be from a foreign language, and it's just showed up, and it's now being used by people who don't know what it means. When Moses first hears the word, he has no idea what it means. But I've come to the view, which is shared by many very erudite scholars of the Hebrew tradition, that Yahweh is actually a recollection of sounds, that it's not a word, it's not a name, it's a sequence of sounds. And embedded in the Yahweh name are these two H's, a sound, which is almost silent the way we pronounce Yahweh today. But if you go to Proto-Northwest Semitic, which is the ancestor of the modern Semitic language, was voiced like this. And that's a sound that you can find in narratives all around the world, a k or a ch. You can find it in the name Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, Cucumatz, Kolkis, Kur, Ikuchu, Kuchedra. These are all around the world, and these are names associated with those cultures' dragon stories. And I show in the Eden Conspiracy that the early Yahweh stories fit perfectly well in the pattern of dragon stories that we find all around the world. And those are memories of contact with other kinds of being, and they are stories of social progress. And the early Yahweh story absolutely fits that pattern.
I hope you're enjoying this video, because if you are, there are dozens more like it on my site, all supported by people like you. So if you'd like to keep this work rolling in and join our community, just click on the Patreon button at reginameredith.com. That also gives you access to insider commentary, my live book club, and other live events with special guests. So join in. Thanks. Now, this is where this audience will feel some familiar with the story of the notion of reptilian colonizers. This is a story that's come up quite a bit, and certainly the work that was done by Zechariah Sitchin initially, and then also by Eric von Daniken in terms of the understanding of the Elohim. That's where we first began to see that the Elohim was not a god, but a collective of beings. It's plural. So I think most people are familiar with that. But the notion of Yahweh as being a reptilian figure of extraordinary proportions, and in fact is depicted as a dragon that breathes fire from its nostrils. This is something that I hadn't picked up before. Is this common knowledge among your circle?
Well, it's common knowledge, but it may be interpreted in various ways, because there are plenty of references to Yahweh as a dragon in the texts. And so his snout is described, and the destructive fire that can come from his snout, the thickness of his skin, the length of his tail, his flight feathers. Mm-hmm. In the book of Job, Yahweh compares himself with other physical monsters and says he's even tougher than they are, and you'll never get an arrow through his hide. And this is all there for people to read, but what we often do when we come to these texts is, oh, that must be poetry. That must be a metaphor.
Right.
And if you read the Bible in a bubble, then you can remain with that view. But as soon as you start reading it alongside other ancestral narratives all around the world, you realize this is the same story. This is the same description. A reptilian with feathers, a reptilian that manages through fear, that can breathe fire. This is the same story. And when you see them alongside each other, you have to ask, how can different cultures, who've had no contact with each other, come up with the same story that once we were colonized by beings who were very intelligent, very advanced, were reptilian, had feathers? Why would they all invent the same thing randomly? Is it not possible that this is a visual memory that all these cultures have curated? And once you see that, you come back to those texts and realize the writers are telling us straight what was seen and what this entity looked like and how it behaved. One of the reasons that we take it as poetry is because there was a very real effort between the 8th and 6th century BCE by the Jewish kings to obliterate the memory of what Yahweh looked like. So there was a carving of Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple called the Nehushtan, which was destroyed. there were reliefs showing the Tseva Hashemayim, which is the great spectrum of beings and races who co-occupied our planet in the deep past, and the high priest sends the army in to destroy those so that there's no memory of what these beings look like. And that's why we get to modern times and people are unfamiliar with any kind of physical image of Yahweh and have to realize there are verbal descriptions which we've glossed over because we've read it in a religious kind of way.
Okay, so let's get to a little bit of the characterological part of Yahweh, and I'll just read a passage from your book. This was according to Hosea, right? It was one of Yahweh's messages to the people. And I think it's important that this is in here to understand what we're dealing with, and then look at why this was politically changed into an all-present God. So this says, I will murder you horribly because you've displeased me. No one will be able to protect you from me. I will get you. But if you please me, I will protect you. I suppose from me, right? Also,
Yes.
I smite you and I save you, but only if you worship me. Now, obviously, these are not the words of any kind of refined or elevated higher dimensional being. And this is throughout the Old Testament. And what I never understood, even as a child, was how anyone could listen to any of these words and think that that was God speaking. A child knows that. Yet, the Western world has been settled upon this fear and thus an inferiority complex amongst the humans. So let's talk about how that came to be. Why did the Jewish royalty choose to take this beast on and represent it as God? And then we'll get to Ashara or Asherah.
I mean, certainly when you describe that behavior, anyone who's been in a relationship with an abusive partner will recognize the psychology that's coming in that speech. You know, nobody loves you. Only I love you, but only if you please me. And if you displease me, I will hurt you, and nobody can protect you from me because nobody loves you like I do. All that gaslighting is the hallmark of an abusive relationship, but it's also the language of colonization. Every colonizer does that. You know, you're going to find yourself in a war. Do you want me helping you or harming you?
I'm here. You can't get rid of me, so you choose, right?
That's right. And so that's really what that language is. It's not just about the psychology of the being. It's about the experience of being colonized and overpowered. And so the early memories of Yahweh are about that. And it explains why when you get to the book of Jeremiah or Second Kings, the writers tell us that the people remembered Asherah with affection, and they had rejected the Yahweh tradition. They didn't obey his laws. They spoke slightingly of him. They disrespected him. And we're told this. Only the narrator then says, isn't that awful? And the reader's expected to agree. But why? Why was the memory of one positive and one negative? The stories of Asherah are of being helped in the deep past, of nurture of humanity in the deep past. The stories of Yahweh are of colonization. So it makes sense. The popular memory would be that way around. But then what happens is that the royalty decide they're going to choose one God from this great plethora,
And
this kaleidoscope they have to choose from.
Well, politically, how would they gain from that?
By the time the what's called the Great Reform began with King Hezekiah in the 8th century BCE, what you had throughout Judea and throughout the Levant was a spectrum of priesthoods and temples and standing stones, all honoring different advanced beings. So there were standing stones scattered throughout the country, marking the place where the people had met an advanced being. And so Jacob does that when he has his experience of beings coming from space, landing, and then going back and up into space via the ladder. So he's got standing stones there at Bethel. Standing stones like that are throughout the country. They become temples. They are staffed by priesthoods. And so you living in your local village, If you want guidance, you'll go to one of their divining rooms. At Harvest Festival, you'll go to the temple to Asherah and thank Asherah for helping the people learn all the secrets of agriculture. If you lived in another place, you might go to the temple of Baal. If you lived in Philistine country, you'd go to the temple of Dagon and thank Dagon for his tuition in the deep past. If you were a Yahwist in Jerusalem, you would go to the Yahwist temple and give thanks to him for all his assistance. How it played out is that Jerusalem was where the royal court was, as well as the Jerusalem temple. And there was a real pivot that happened when a boy of 8 years old became king. And he presided over a restoration of the temple in Jerusalem. And at some point, the high priest brings to him a little book that he'd discovered, lost apparently, in the ruins of the old temple, the Book of the Laws of Yahweh. And so this is now happening when the boy king is about 26. And so he decides he needs to reform the whole nation. What's the point of him worshipping Yahweh while his people are worshipping all these other beings? They should all worship his God. He's the king. And of course, because he came in at 8 years old, he's got into a pattern of seeking advice from people helping him reign. And his great helper was Uncle Hilkiah, the high priest of the Jerusalem temple. So by the time Josiah really gets going, for 18 years, he's had his uncle Hilkiah come to him and say, "Sire, I have identified another threat to your authority over your kingdom. Do you want me to take care of it?" "Oh, thank you, Hilkiah. Yes, please do." And what that meant each time was that he would shut down another priesthood, demolish another temple, knock down more standing stones, so that they would end up with only the temple in Jerusalem, where he was high priest, so that all the tithes would come to Jerusalem, not to these other temples out there, so that when people wanted guidance, there was no other priesthood to go to, no priests of Baal, no priests of Asherah, all come to the high priestly family in Jerusalem. So there's this great centralization of wealth and power through this reform and turning Judaism into the worship of a single deity. It's unfortunate that that deity was chosen because there were nicer beings they could have commemorated. And by choosing Yahweh, a violent colonizer, it sort of empowers the king to act with force or violence to impose his will, because he's only doing it on behalf of Yahweh.
That's what I was going to ask you. There had to be an advantage in choosing the most brutal of all of the gods, certainly the most fearsome of all of the gods, so that he would be able to have the benefit of the obedience of the people as Yahweh demands himself, correct?
Exactly. And you become what you worship. Mm-hmm. So if you're worshiping a violent colonizer, you have to justify xenophobia, violence, brutality. And that is the history of what has happened. When that has been our image of God, we have justified the invasion of other people's countries, the enslavement of other people groups, all kinds of misogyny, all kinds of persecutions, thinking we're doing God a favor. And I think it all comes from that distortion of identifying these stories of colonization and this colonizing figure and saying, that's our God.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And you might also want to consider joining Patreon, which allows me to keep all of this content free and available to everyone. And if you're looking for like-minded souls, you might also enjoy my online community called Our Neighborhood. Links to join are in the description.